Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this hearing of the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. We'll now come to order. And under Committee Rule 4F, any opening statements, oral opening statements of this hearing are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice ranking member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this important hearing to examine the many threats facing one of the most endangered marine mammals in the world, the North American right whale, North Atlantic right whale. There are less than 420 right whales remaining. That's fewer right whales in existence than members of Congress. If more is not done to save this iconic species, scientists predict it will go extinct in the next few decades. According to Noaa Fisheries, in order to maintain a sustainable right whale population, no more than one right whale per year can be killed by human causes. And as Dr. Krause has pointed out in his written testimony, that number has been exceeded every single year for the last 20 years. No wonder these whales are in such dire straits. 2017 was a particularly bad year for them. There were 17 deaths and no new calves. While we've seen positive news recently, including 7 new calves spotted this year, there are ongoing threats, including fishing gear entanglements and accidental ship strikes. And additionally, the science shows that climate change may be shifting the food source northward, which means the whales will be moving further into areas with shipping lanes and lobster traps. So today we'll be talking about several promising solutions that we can act on quickly, including ropeless technology for lobster traps, vessel speed reductions, zooplankton monitoring, coordination with Canada, and more. In addition to this technological innovation and coordination, it's critical to move legislation like the Bipartisan Save Right Whales Act, which was just reintroduced by my colleague Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. This bill would provide financial resources for research to develop and test technologies to reduce entanglements and vessel collisions to help the right whale. However, in addition to entanglements and ship strikes, a new issue further endangers the North Atlantic right whale. In yet another handout to the oil and gas industry, the Trump administration is now actively threatening the long-term survival of these whales by opening up the Atlantic coast to seismic airgun blasting and oil and gas exploration activities. As we've consistently seen with other decisions from the administration, this completely undermines our foundational environmental laws like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the ESA. Seismic airguns are harmful to many forms of marine life, ranging from plankton, the base of the ocean food web, to fish and right whales. For right whales and other marine mammals, sound is critical for communication, feeding, navigation, and survival. But just last year, Noaa Fisheries issued incidental harassment authorizations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to allow 5 companies to use seismic airgun blasting to survey the Atlantic continental shelf for oil and gas. These airgun blasts occur as often as every 10 seconds for months at a time, creating noise that is louder than all but military-grade explosives. Thanks to Noaa issuing these authorizations, seismic companies plan to fire air guns a combined 5 million times over the course of their testing. I also want to point out several major problems with these authorizations, considering the near-extinct status of this species. First, even though 5 different companies requested permits to conduct surveys within similar timeframes, similar locations, Noaa Fisheries did not consider the cumulative impacts here. The fact that when combined with each other and other activities, there is a vast increase in ocean noise. Instead, the agency analyzed the impacts of each survey in isolation, ignoring the fact that the ocean's already a very loud place and set to become 5 million blasts louder under these authorizations. Second, Noaa Fisheries' proposed mitigation is to prohibit blasting within 90 kilometers of the coast between November and April. But we know that right whales, including mothers and calves, the most vulnerable of the species, are present in this area nearly year-round, not just between November and April. We also know that sound travels great distances underwater, and a small buffer like this is unlikely to shield these whales completely from the negative impacts of that seismic testing. And third, Under the Obama administration, BOEM rejected the seismic permit applications for testing in the Atlantic because of the impacts on marine life, including the right whale. They stated, quote, "The value of obtaining geophysical information from the new seismic airgun surveys in the Atlantic does not outweigh the potential risks of those surveys. Acoustic pulse impacts on marine life. New science decisions have changed. It could start imminently. Air blasts within 30 days of BOEM's issuing of the permit. Seismic blasts could make the difference in recovery and extinction. Given the many threats facing efforts underway to save them, for Noaa Fisheries to allow to occur. There are technologies and innovations to help the right forward to hearing more about that today. It's critical that we don't add new things to just make the oil industry. And with that, I look forward to this, and I now invite the ranking of his remarks.
Thank you. The problem with vision apocalypse is that as the area passes, life the world doesn't end. I can't imagine that is to the prophets of Chicken Little found that out. Many today could learn from her. For example, at our hearings recently, the only geologist on the panel confirmed the rise has been steady throughout the 20th century and shows no correlation with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Indeed, he noted the oceans have been rising about 400 feet since the last ice age and can be expected to continue to do so very gradually until temperature equilibrium is achieved. In the 1980s, climate change was blamed for the impending extinction of the polar bear. You may have noticed we don't hear much about polar bear extinction these days because it turns out their populations are doing very well, thank you, and have actually been increasing nicely since 2005 along with carbon dioxide levels. So today we adopt a new mascot, the right whale. Now the right whale got its name from the whalers who drove it nearly to extinction in the days when whale oil was in high demand. It was the right whale to hunt to supply the lucrative whale oil market. Ironically, it may have been saved from outright extinction by, wait for it, fossil fuels, which made whale oil obsolete. Now, however, the right whale is being repurposed as an excuse to discourage fossil fuel use and to impede offshore exploration. We hear voices accusing the dreaded Donald Trump of decimating marine animals by his administration's support of incidental harassment authorizations, which allow for limited seismic testing in the Atlantic outer continental shelf. Now, before we all set our hair on fire, let's confront a few inconvenient truths. It was the Obama administration's 2015 five-year oil and gas leasing program that initially proposed opening the Atlantic to offshore energy exploration, and it was the Obama administration that approved multiple permits supporting seismic testing. From 2015 through 2017, Columbia University received 4 permits for seismic activity to gather scientific data, including 2 permits for seismic testing in the Atlantic. Furthermore, the United States Geological Survey conducted seismic surveys in the Atlantic Ocean between 2014 and 2015. Seismic testing is not unique to offshore oil and gas exploration, nor has it been found to be detrimental to marine mammal stocks. Under the Obama administration, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management both determined that there is no documented evidence of anything more than a negligible impact to marine mammals resulting from exposure to seismic testing on the ocean floor. It may be annoying, but it is far from dangerous. We may hear much about the taking of marine mammals under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Now, to most people, taking sounds like a euphemism for killing. In fact, I think it's meant to convey this false impression, but is actually used in the Act. It means anything that disturbs marine animals irrespective of the health of the marine mammal stock. Now, whaling excesses in the pre-fossil fuels period almost destroyed the right whales in the northern Atlantic and the northern Pacific. Their populations were driven so low that they're barely measurable today, particularly in the northern Pacific. And sadly, they have shown little sign of recovery. Fortunately, they are doing very well in the southern Atlantic and Pacific. According to the Marine Mammal Center, quote, The breeding populations of Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and Australia have shown evidence of strong recovery with annual increase rates of 7 to 8%, and together may now total over 16,000. And there's more good news. In the North Pacific and Atlantic, other species of whales hunted in the last century are recovering, including blue whales growing about 3% per year, humpback whales, which have already recovered their pre-whaling populations, fin whales growing 4 to 5% per year in the North Pacific, with their populations in the North Atlantic described as healthy. All of this according to the Marine Mammal Center. So there is a lot here to celebrate. Species are recovering in the Northern Hemisphere, and the right whale population recovery in the Southern Hemisphere. All happily, so too energy independence in the American economy, with great promise for future prosperity and growth from our offshore reserves. So, Mr. Chairman, let's try not to screw all that up today, please.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. I feel so much better hearing that this is all a hoax and hysteria. Perhaps the experts and scientists we'll hear from will confirm that, and then we can all just go home. Let's find out. Right now, before we move to the witnesses, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleperson from Virginia, Mr. Byer, and also the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's proceeding. Without objection, it is so ordered. Now, I'll introduce our first witness. Welcome to Chris Oliver, the Assistant Administrator for Noaa Fisheries. Welcome, Mr. Oliver. Mr. Oliver, under the committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, light will come on, and your time will have expired. Light. I will now ask at that point to wrap up. The chair now recognizes you to testify.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. Chris Oliver with Noaa Fisheries. The North Atlantic right whale is one of the world's most endangered large whale species, with an estimated, as you mentioned, 411 individuals. In the early 90s, the successful implementation of measures aimed at reducing primary threats resulted in some encouraging population growth. However, since 2010, the whales have experienced another period of decline. Because the population is very small, its status can change quickly. Right whales have also made recent large-scale changes in habitat use, spending more time farther offshore and to the north, likely in pursuit of better foraging opportunities. They're protected under both the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and have been listed as endangered since 1970. We are currently implementing a North Atlantic right whale recovery plan with the ultimate goal of recovering this species. We're working to protect and recover this species on multiple fronts. Human interactions such as entanglement in fishing gear and vessel strikes currently present the greatest threat. Collisions between whales and vessels often go unnoticed and unreported. Research demonstrates that the probability of large whale mortality and serious injury from vessel strikes increases with vessel speed. Noaa Fisheries has taken several steps to reduce this threat, including requiring vessels to slow down in areas where whales may be present, encouraging voluntary speed reductions, recommended alternative shipping routes in international shipping lanes, developing right whale alert systems and vessel reporting systems, and improving our stranding response. Since 2008, we have limited vessel speeds to 10 knots for vessels greater than 65 feet in seasonal management areas along the U.S. East Coast. The purpose of this regulation is to reduce the likelihood of deaths and serious injuries to endangered whales resulting from collisions with ships. In the 10 years prior to implementation of that regulation, there were 11 confirmed right whale mortalities due to vessel strikes in U.S. waters. In the 10 years since, only 3 ship strike mortalities have been confirmed. Entanglements in fishing gear is the other primary cause of serious injury and death for many whales, including right whales. We require fishermen to use certain gear modifications to reduce entanglement risk, such as sinking ground lines, weak link connections, pot limits, and closed areas. However, entanglements continue to be a source of injury and mortality, with at least 7 mortalities occurring during the 2017 unusual mortality event. In addition, we are working with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to develop management measures to further reduce the risk of entanglements in gear. On the international front, we recognize the transboundary range of this species requires international collaboration, we are actively working with Canada on the gaps in both science and management impeding the recovery of North Atlantic right whales. In March of last year, Canada adopted regulations on its commercial fishing and maritime shipping industries to minimize both gear entanglements and ship strikes in advance of the North Atlantic right whale migrations, which is now into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Continuing bilateral engagement and implementation of our respective regulatory regimes will ensure that the U.S. and Canada are fully complying with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and eliminating the risks to North Atlantic right whales while ensuring sustainable fisheries and trade. As we move forward, Noaa Fisheries and our partners will strive to make progress in rebuilding the North Atlantic right whale population. This year, we anticipate the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to consider developing an addendum to its lobster management plan to consider measures to reduce the number of buoy lines used by American lobster fishermen by up to 40%. This would represent a substantial reduction in gear and significantly reduce the probability of entanglements. Further, the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team will meet the week of April 22nd to develop additional recommended changes to the take reduction plan. These include additional closure areas as well as reporting, monitoring, and expanded gear marking requirements. Finally, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, Noaa Fisheries is pleased to report the births of several right whale calves this season, 7 as of February 20th, which is good news, given that it comes on the heels of 2 years of virtually no calf production. And so thank you for the opportunity to discuss our conservation measures today, and I would be happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliver. I will begin the questioning for 5 minutes. And again, thank you for being here. I hope to do in this session these informational, the factual and scientific issues that we debate. McClintock provides us with colorful Dickens and Lewis Carroll, but for actual facts. And I'd like to get a few things on the record you if I could, and questions quickly, so if you can answer yes or no. And when I refer to the agency, I'm talking about Noaa Fisheries. So, true 120 North Atlantic right today. Now, Dr. Krause may say that, but is that the general understanding? Yes. He is concerned about the survival of true?
Yes.
The potential biological or PBR term that your agency defined quantify the number of seriously injured or killed without impacting the population.
I believe that generally accepted definition.
And for the last has hovered somewhere between 0, right?
I believe that's correct.
Actual number of right whale deaths each higher than that, mainly because of fishing gear entanglements, correct? Is the agency trying to address issues and ship strikes in order to species?
Yes, sir.
Put a lot of work into a required to do under the Endangered Species Act, correct?
Correct.
Now, I hope to work with you more on that. But in the meantime, this year, there's a little bit of good news. We've got 7 calves sighted so far, right?
Yes, sir.
As we will hear from our second panel of experts, there are fewer than 100 breeding females in the population. You agree with that assessment?
That's correct, yes.
And we know that females travel to the southeast each year to give birth, the breeding females. Is there scientific evidence that elevated ambient noise can cause chronic stress in baleen whales, especially breeding females?
There is evidence that the cumulative effects of acoustics can affect foraging behavior, calving, breeding behavior, basically sublethal effects relative to whale energetics, yes. You
agree with the science that says seismic noise increases the probability that right whale mothers and calves could get separated?
I'm not an expert on acoustics, the degree to which acoustics would directly...
Yeah. Agree with that science?
No, sir.
Agree that with the claim in testimony in the second panel that seismic behavior of baleen whales at kilometers.
Yes, sir.
The plankton that they depend on.
That one, sir.
Would you also agree right whales may be present but not visually detected?
That is correct.
The agency's mitigation requirement harassment authorizations only amount of activity if the whales are visually detected within 1,500 meters of the vessel, even though the science suggests there could be disruption from noise at tens to hundreds of kilometers.
But we have measures in place to hopefully minimize the likelihood that those whales would be in the area at the same time those vessels are conducting those activities.
Understood. Your authorizations also apply only to 90 kilometers of the coast, even though seismic noise can travel long distances underwater and still increase the stress level on these whales within that buffer zone, correct?
Correct.
It's also true that the agency's mitigation requirement in these authorizations prohibit blasting within this limited buffer only between November and April, correct? Even though we know that whales can be present during different time frames.
So, a little more than a yes or no response, sir. The other times of the year, there are still closures in effect out to 30 nautical miles, but based on the information we have, and we expanded those original closures between what we originally proposed at 47 kilometers out to 90, or nearly doubled it, based on some of the information that you cite that the whales have expanded the areas they occupy seaward and northward. Again, the likely present in that area as we feel is.
Last question, because I expected there. It seems to me on the one hand you're working to recover these animals. You're allowing very limited buffers and limited mitigations in your authorizations. Were there internal conversations where scientists objected?
No, sir. Our internal conversations, available science that we had.
There were no dissenters among the scientists and your team?
Dissenters to what?
To allow these activities within these very limited buffers.
Our role is not on issuing the permits, sir. It's on the appropriate mitigation measures.
There were scientists who believed were inadequate to protect this species.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yesterday, there was more seismic administration than administration. Is that accurate?
Apologize, sir. I do not know the answer to that question. That's something I'm unfamiliar with the degree of seismic activity across the two.
Well, I'm told that was the yesterday. If it's true, I'm shocked, just shocked that my friends on the left aren't shocked, just shocked. Can you tell us, what are we observing of other whale species? Are they declining or increasing?
I don't know this. We have had a couple of mortality events with us over the past few years, but those, I guess, disassociated, and it's not clear that there's a relation.
They're increasing, are they not?
They're increasing.
And increasing rate, 3 to 5.
I haven't to number. I don't know the exact rate.
Mr. Krause, I am told, will the National Marine Fisheries opinion on seismic fraud. Specifically, the 2017 model used it wasn't adequate. Do you agree?
I don't agree. I would note that the reconsulting and developing biological opinion.
He's going to follow you. Do you want to address those issues, address your concerns with his interpretation of the science here?
I don't know that I'm in a position to do that at the table here today, sir.
Can you tell me, has this administration or the previous found that there is anything more than a negligible impact on whales due to seismic activity?
No, sir. I don't believe our agency has ever not issued or approved a request from an applicant for an incidental harassment authorization in either administration. And I would note that the prevailing scientific information is that seismic activity does not result in mortality or even serious injury. Rather, the prevailing science is it does not. I would acknowledge there are other sublethal energetic effects.
And the whale populations that are increasing in the North Atlantic, I presume, are also affected by the same seismic testing.
They would be, yes, sir.
How about the right whale population in the southern hemisphere, which is described as increasing at about 3%, I believe?
I believe that's correct, 3 to 5% in the southern hemisphere, correct.
So doing quite well there with seismic testing. Something in the North Atlantic might have to do with the fact that the population left in the North Atlantic was so small to begin with. As I understand it, seismic testing is already heavily regulated, including requirements that trained professionals be present to detect whales with the power to shut down testing. Could you elaborate on the safeguards such as seismic testing a bit?
Well, yes, as you've noted and I've noted earlier, we have to find a negligible impact when we're asked to review these authorization requests and include mitigation monitoring and reporting requirements that result in the least practical adverse impact. And if we're able to do so, and we think that we've done so with some what we believe are significant mitigation measures, including the 90-kilometer closure, as well as multiple critical habitat and calving area closures that remain year-round, along with the provision for shutdown if whales are detected within 1.5 miles. So we believe collectively those satisfy the standards that we are authorized to evaluate under the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Can you tell us what the U.S. fishing industry has done to prevent interactions with right whales, and for that matter, any whales?
There's a lot of promising research, actually, and a lot of incentive upon the fishing industry, and particularly in the wake of the unusual mortality event we had in 2017, a renewed and redoubled effort by both our agency and Canada and the fishing industry to find ways to minimize those interactions, including sinking lines, reductions in the number of lines, breakaways, and some promising technology on the use of ropeless fishing gear.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Van Drew for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Oliver. Seismic air gun blasting for oil and gas has ramifications for all manner of marine life. Scientific studies show that seismic air gun noise can disturb, injure, or kill marine life from zooplankton at the base of the food web up to the fish and marine mammals at the top. In a recent study, a single seismic air gun caused massive mortality in zooplankton, a vital prey species in the ecosystem, over a 1.5-mile swath of ocean. Air gun noise can delay growth and cause body abnormalities in young scallops. Sounds from seismic air guns can cause physical damage to fish hearing structures and leading to hearing loss itself, which leaves them unable to use sound for communicating, feeding, or escaping predators. Catch rates of some commercially and recreational important fish species are known to decrease substantially in the wake of seismic air gun blasting for oil and gas. In fact, seismic air gun blasting can lead to declines in catch rates by as much as 80% of some fish species. This is concerning as healthy fish stocks are critical for our nation's fisheries continue to thrive. And I believe we all know how important the fishing industry, just alone in my state of New Jersey, it's the third largest industry. This is concerning as healthy fish stocks are critical for our nation's fisheries to continue. How would this play out for Atlantic fisheries?
Well, Congressman Van Drew, I'm not certain I understand your question, whether it was relative to right whales or fisheries. We evaluate, as does BOEM, in their issuance of the permitting activities through biological opinions, impacts on fisheries as well as essential fish habitat. So that would be evaluated through essentially a separate process.
Well, how do you propose protecting fishermen and coastal businesses if catch rates drop in the Atlantic?
I'm not aware of any specific evidence that indicates the proposed seismic activity that we're talking about would somehow directly affect catch rates. And I apologize if that information's there. I'm not aware of it.
Okay. Regarding seismic surveys for oil and gas deposits off the Atlantic coast, I have heard people say, why don't we just see what's out there? They argue that it's okay to go ahead with seismic airgun surveys so that public and policymakers can weigh the pros and the cons of drilling for oil and gas in the Atlantic Ocean off of our coast. 5 companies have received permits from Noaa to conduct seismic airgun surveys in the Atlantic and are seeking final authorizations from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the Department of the Interior. If these 5 companies go ahead with seismic airgun blasting in the Atlantic, will we be able to see what's out there?
I presume that if they undertake their seismic activities, that will the point of doing so would be to ascertain whether and to what extent there are resources there that would warrant actual oil and gas exploration, which would also be permitted by BOEM.
Will the public have access to the data collected by these companies on possible oil and gas deposits off of our shores?
I believe that much of the information they collect is proprietary. I think through the EIS process, public will have access to whatever information we have, but I can't speak to every bit of information that may be proprietary to the particular companies involved.
Well, if that information will be available to the public, then why are there 5 different companies seeking permits to explore the same area?
I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, Congressman. I guess they each needed a permit, so they each applied for a permit. I suppose it could have been done under a more programmatic type single authorization request, but in this case, there were 5 separate requests.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witness, for being here today with us. In the past, the National Marine Fisheries Service has concluded that seismic surveying poses no significant threat to marine life. In 2014, for example, your agency concluded, and I want to quote here, to date, there is no evidence that serious injury, death, or stranding by marine mammals can occur from exposure to airgun pulses, even in the case of large airgun arrays. Is that still the case?
Yes, I believe that is still the case. We recognize there are other sublethal energetic effects, but not any direct mortality or serious injury effects.
Has the National Marine Fisheries Service found any new evidence since 2014 to conclude that seismic surveying significantly threatens the North Atlantic right whale and other marine species?
No.
Do vessels collision, entanglements in lines and nets, and ingestion of plastic pose higher threats?
Yes, Congresswoman. In fact, vessel strikes and even more so entanglement in fishery gear are the 2 by far primary sources of mortality and serious injury.
In 2018, Mr. Oliver, Noaa Fisheries issued final authorizations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to incidentally but not intentionally harass marine mammals to companies proposing to conduct geophysical surveys in support of the hydrocarbon exploration in the Atlantic Ocean. Can you discuss the procedures and analysis that go into your agency decision making those processes when issue those kind of authorizations?
I'll try to be brief. It was a lengthy process that took place over a couple of years, started before I came on board in this position, but it involved publication of proposed permits with attendant mitigation measures. It went through, I believe, 2 different public comment periods where we received over 120,000 different public comments, including many very detailed technical and scientific based comments from both proponents and opponents of that seismic activity. And ultimately, we assessed, following our proposed rule, assessed those comments and made some changes to the proposed rule. In a couple of cases, we relaxed some of the protection measures, particularly with regard to small dolphins. In other cases, we actually expanded the protection measures from what was originally proposed. For example, for the right whale specifically, enlarging the closure area from 47 to 90 kilometers.
I do understand that the harassment definition between level A and level B are a little bit different, right? And the one in level B is going to be a little complicated and it's going to be unclear on how it will be affected. Can you give us an overview of the National Marine Fisheries Service effort to conserve and rebuild the North Atlantic right whale population? And how you understand Congress can help in that effort as well?
Yes, Congresswoman. I mean, from a general perspective, again, we're looking at taking regulatory and non-regulatory steps to reduce the threat of vessel collisions. And earlier in my testimony, I went through some of the details of that. So in the interest of time, I won't repeat them. But we're also reviewing, in the process of reviewing those restrictions to assess both their effectiveness, the enforcement compliance with them, as well as safety and navigation and coastal economic impacts in order to assess perhaps changes to those restrictions. And secondly, a lot of work going on in the area of entanglements and a very heightened focus, including recent action by Canada in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and increased attention on the part of our fishermen and our fisheries management process to look at additional restrictions in U.S. fishermen waters, including development of ropeless fishing gear, including requirements for the limitations on the number of traps that can be run, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I yield back the balance of the time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Grijalva. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the courtesy. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. The hearings that this committee has undertaken have been substantive, empirical information being at the center of the discussion, and I sets a very good, I think, tone for how we should be dealing with a lot of the questions that face the committee as a whole. And that is the fact that if science needs to guide us, fact needs to guide us, because we're dealing with elements in our jurisdiction that demand that. And the fact that we've ignored it doesn't make it right. And so I want to thank you for that and for the tone. And thank you, Mr. Oliver, for your testimony, for being here. Let me just go into some questions on some issues that perhaps I think also need to be covered relative to your testimony. Mr. Oliver, some reports indicate that up to 85% of North American right whales have scars associated with interactions with fishing gear. And my question is, what's Noaa doing or planning to do to ensure that such fishing lines are not deployed in times and places where that right whales are present at the time? Does Noaa have a strong understanding of where fishing that impacts right whales is occurring, and what is the process to address that particular question? If I may, Mr. Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. A number of areas in response to that question. The most important thing that we can do to minimize these entanglement occurrences is to better understand where and when right whales are occurring, and obviously, and we know that through recent scientific studies and information, they are changing some of those patterns. For example, part of the reason we had the large mortality event in 2017 is they apparently moved into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canadian waters, where there was a concentration of fishing gear, which was a relatively new migration pattern or feeding.
If I may, at that point, Mr. Oliver, so right whales are migrating to new locations, and in part due to climate change. So, to that point that you made, what is NOAA doing to address climate change shifts? And as migrating patterns shift because of the change, what appropriate management tools, new technologies, what's being used to deal with that ongoing reality? That's, now that we know that.
Yeah, well, we're trying to better understand exactly where these shifts in zooplankton and phytoplankton are occurring so that we can predict where right whales are more likely to occur, so that we can in turn consider gear restrictions or fisheries closures in those areas. And again, it's a matter of us understanding where those wells are going to be and taking the necessary measures to reduce the juxtaposition of those wells and fishing gear. And we have a lot of research ongoing in that regard.
Specifically, Mr. Oliver, the regulations to reduce the fatal ship strikes on right whales have, successfully in that area lowered the mortality. I'm aware that NOAA is currently in the process of analyzing that particular rule, including its effectiveness and its cost. First of all, is that a true statement?
Yes.
And where is the status of that review at this point?
We expect a preliminary report by this summer, which would then be subject to both peer review and public comment and issuance of a final report later this year.
And to absolutely put you on the spot, can you assure us that NOAA will not recommend undermining the protections currently in place under that rule for right whales through this review?
I can't assure what the outcome of the review is going to be, but I'm certainly hopeful that, given the current status of this species, that any relaxation in certain areas would be for a very, very good reason, based on knowledge of either effects.
Do you believe,
science.
During this review, do you believe, given the urgency of the topic right now and the right whales, do you believe that there are opportunities that are going to exist to strengthen that ship strike rule?
I think the opportunity is there, yes, sir.
Okay. Yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lambourne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing today. This is an important topic, and so it's good that we're here. Mr. Oliver, I want to thank you for coming today. As you know, we appreciate the hard work you do for the American people, even in the face of sometimes reckless accusations or radical science deniers and political opportunists. As we all focus on the right whale today, I wanted to touch on seismic and try to put back the science back into this hearing. And I'm glad that the chairman talked about the need for science. That's always better than emotionalism. So how long have we been conducting geophysical work to find resources in our oceans?
Well, I don't know the exact answer, sir, but at least 50 or 60 years.
Okay, and do you I'm told 80 years. Does that sound correct to you?
That's probably more accurate, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to list a few reasons for conducting this important geophysical research, and I want you to just answer yes or no on my list of questions, whether or not that geophysical research in the Atlantic Ocean would need an incidental harassment authorization. If you are conducting geophysical work to dredge shipping channels, do you need an IHA?
I think you probably do, but it might be situation specific.
How about researching sea bottom characteristics for offshore wind installation?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Planning and exploring for sand resources for beach replenishment and rebuilding.
Again, I think that is correct, but I'm not certain on the situation.
And my understanding is that it is, so.
I have no reason to believe that it isn't.
Thank you, thank you. And how about unexploded ordnance surveys?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, thank you. In fact, we have seen seismic geophysical work in the Atlantic for nearly all these reasons in just the last 4 years. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a list of these surveys that IHAs have been required for the record today. Thank you. Now, Mr. Oliver, knowing that all this work has been done, has, in just the last 4 years, much less going back 80 years, has it decimated right whale populations in the Atlantic, or has the mitigation, observer requirements, and strong science that lays at the foundation of Noaa IHA decisions proven successful in allowing us to do the work we need to do, while at the same time conserving the species we need to conserve?
I believe it's the latter, sir, yes.
And could you explain that, please?
Well, I believe that, again, as far as we know, the primary source of mortality by far for North Atlantic right whales particularly is vessel strikes and vessel entanglement. And again, there's no evidence whatsoever of any direct mortality or serious injury to the right whales from seismic activity.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Oliver, I want to follow up on the questions that Chair Grijalva asked you about the ship strike reduction rule. I want to really talk about a discussion about how I believe, or maybe we can discuss your thoughts on how it can be strengthened right now, to talk about strengthening the rules. You know, in 2008, National Marine Fisheries Service published the ship strike reduction rule, and it imposed a mandatory speed limit of 10 knots per hour on vessels that were 65 feet in length or greater along parts of the Atlantic seaboard at certain times of the year to prevent these collisions between the ships and the North Atlantic right whales. They determined that 65 feet was the appropriate length, below 65, because that was the categorization that was used to differentiate between motorboats and larger vessels and, you know, commercial vessels. And that larger vessels were subject to certain regulatory control, where smaller vessels were not. But we all know that a vessel of 65 feet or smaller can cause great harm to a North Atlantic right whale. Has the agency ever considered putting a speed limit in seasonal management areas for vessels that are smaller than 65? And if not, why not? And if you have, where are we in that discussion?
I honestly don't know, sir, whether in that original process of establishing those speed restrictions, whether and to what extent we considered vessels less than 65 feet. I think it has something to do with not only vessel size, but automated information system, AIS tracking, that typically is required of all the larger vessels. Therefore, our ability to track and monitor and compliance with the vessel speed restrictions. So I think there's a monitoring and compliance aspect to it. I would agree with you, though, that it makes sense if we didn't carefully evaluate that length threshold in the original rule. It would make sense to me that we should be looking at that as part of this review in the current review.
To follow up, I'm glad you will be. But another question is, you know, how successful have you been in terms of actually reducing speed? I think in what is called, in studies that were prepared for Noaa, December 2012, that voluntary speed limits in what are called dynamic management areas, they're parts of these areas, have only had limited success in reducing vehicle speed. They're still striking these animals. And that part of it, another study, Noaa has previously stated that there's a high level of non-compliance with these voluntary speed reductions. And that 95% of the ships that tracked in the Great South Channel didn't slow down, even when they were, they were noted to them that there was a speed advisory due to right whale sailing. They weren't slowing down. If that's the case, why aren't these restrictions mandatory? And why aren't we enforcing them then?
Mr. Congressman, I do think that that's one of the important points that will be assessed in this review, and that is compliance with the rule. I know that we have, in fact, our Office of Law Enforcement has a great deal of information on compliance and violations that will be brought forward in that report. We've issued a number of very large penalties under this, but I would agree with you that if we identify areas that we believe are critical with regard to this issue of speed restrictions, critical relative to the right whale, that we should be seriously considering whether to make those areas mandatory as opposed to voluntary.
Well, thank you. And last, you know, we've had issues on the West Coast too, off my coast, the Pacific, on whales. And we have a voluntary program in place I'd like to describe to you later or put into the record, but it's based upon recognition. That is, if those shipping lines and others reduce their speed to significantly slower speed, we provide them with recognition, and they all agree to do it, and they all lower, and we have lowered the air pollution significantly, especially in Santa Barbara and Ventura County, which were out of compliance. So there are ways of doing this. I would hope that we would use this as an opportunity to really slow down ships, really, because that is a major danger to the sea life. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Oliver, for being here. As you know, the sort of incidental takings that we're talking about here today under the Marine Mammal Protection Act have to be authorized by NOAA Fisheries. One requirement for the taking authorization is that NOAA must find the activity would, quote, have no more than a negligible impact on the marine mammal species, unquote. In this case, of course, the right whale. What are some of the primary considerations you look at when issuing these permits?
Well, there are a number of things that we need to find, a negligible impact, and I don't have the definition exactly on the top of my head, but it has to not result in long-term population or productivity of the species in question. So that's a primary consideration.
I'm interested to know about ongoing requirements once a permit holder obtains a permit. So do they have to follow requirements, say, if they encounter a protected species while they're engaging in the activity authorized by the permit? So let's say that a seismic study is going on and one of the vessels encounters a right whale. What happens then?
Yes, sir. There are shutdown requirements if a right whale is detected within 1.5 kilometers of the vessel. They're required to immediately shut down their air guns.
How long does the shutdown take? I mean, what's the procedure from that point?
Yeah, I don't know the exact answer of what the criteria is for when they can go back up, but I suspect it's if the right whale subsequently exits the area and is not detectable within 1.5 kilometers, that at some point the activity could resume. I apologize, I don't know the exact time interval. That's something I'd be glad to look into and get back to you on.
I guess the point is that there are some very reasonable restrictions in place, and some of our friends on the activist side want to imply that, you know, operators are just out there wreaking havoc in the seas, and that's not the case, I think. Let me ask you another question. In your testimony, you talk about ongoing collaboration with Canada, and my understanding is that in 2017 there were a total of 17 observed right whale deaths, but 14 of those occurred in Canadian waters. So can you expand on some of the work you're doing with Canadian regulators to minimize the harm they're causing to the right whale population?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, I can. And following that 2017 event, we were very pleased that Canada subsequently last year actually implemented some measures, both with regard to shipping and with regard to gear entanglement. There's very good progress on their part. We collaborate and meet monthly with representatives from the Department of Fisheries, Oceans, as well as Transport Canada on the shipping side. We established a bilateral right whale working group to discuss measures that both countries to consider and to increase our coordination. We participate in aerial surveys with their team in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they in turn participate on our right whale recovery implementation team, and those are just a few of the ways that we interact with at the international front. And I would just add generally that following that event in 2017, the heat, if you will, has turned up on that collaboration and on both of our countries' efforts to particularly seek ways to minimize gear entanglements. So it's really redoubled our efforts in that regard.
I was looking into this, and I was struck by this fact that I was in the second grade the last time there was a comprehensive geological seismic study for the Atlantic coast. It was over 40 years ago. So has that technology advanced from then to now so that we can get more accurate information without being, while being less intrusive to marine life?
I believe it has, and I'm not an expert on it, but that's certainly my understanding and from the information that we've received from some of the seismic and oil and gas companies.
Appreciate you being here, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Oliver, for appearing before us today. I represent the great state of Colorado, and although we are a landlocked state, we certainly care very deeply about our oceans and the species that call our oceans home. Also, we have a number of people in my district, in particular, Colorado 2nd Congressional District, who are very active in this regard. The Inland Oceans Coalition, which has chapters across the western United States, including at the University of Colorado Boulder and Colorado State University, my district, was founded in Colorado and works to build on enthusiasm around marine biology and acknowledgement of the direct impact on the cycles of life in the oceans that are downstream from us. Another example is the Oceans First Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which promotes conservation in future generations by connecting youth with the wonders of the ocean. I want to talk about some of your testimony today, Mr. Oliver. So just taking a step back, my understanding is that new births of North Atlantic right whales have slowed when compared to the early 2000s, and only about 100 breeding females remain in the population. And the only known calving ground for North Atlantic right whale is off the southeast U.S. coast. And of course, as we've talked about during this hearing, the federal government has now granted permits for nearly 850 combined days of seismic surveying for oil exploration in that precise area. What are the potential impacts of the seismic surveys on mothers and calves, which are key to the population growth?
That calving area that are in which no activity would be allowed, those would be closed to seismic activity under the mitigation measures of the authorization that we've granted.
So you believe the permits that have been granted will have no impact on the ability of the right Atlantic whale?
We believe they will have a negligible impact.
A negligible impact. Okay, well, okay, let me take it this way. My understanding is that in 2017, these same permits were denied by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, by the BOEM. Is that right?
My understanding is they put the process on hold and...
Well, I'll quote, I have a quote here, perhaps this could be educational. In early 2017, right, this is according to the BOEM, in denying similar permits, concluding that the, quote, value of obtaining the geophysical and geological information from new airgun seismic surveys in the Atlantic does not outweigh the potential risks of those surveys' acoustic pulse impacts on marine life. Those aren't my words, those are the BOEM, okay. Right? What's changed since 2017?
Well, sir,
I mean, the science hasn't changed,
well, Congressman,
right?
I can't speak to why BOEM did or did not deny the permits. Our role in this,
They did deny the permits, just for the record, but I'm happy to provide you with that.
I understand. I don't know why they did that.
Well, I just explained to you the quote. I mean, they denied the permits because ultimately the benefits to these 5 oil and gas companies were outweighed by the risks to this endangered species. And since that time, the science certainly hasn't changed. The status of the species certainly hasn't changed. It's more threatened, not less. It seems that the only thing has changed since that time is the politics of it. And this is why it's very frustrating, because most of the issues that we deal with are very partisan. But this happens to be an issue that has bipartisan support. Let me give you just a few of the stakeholders in the region who have expressed concern or outright opposition to the granting of these permits. The governor of Florida, Republican. The governor of Georgia, Republican. The governor of South Carolina, Republican. The governor of Maryland, a Republican. The governor of Massachusetts, a Republican. Right? In addition to a variety, of course, Democratic governors, 240 East Coast state municipalities, over 1,500 local, state, and federal bipartisan officials. So there are a litany, a plethora of experts and folks in these communities who have said that this is not a prudent thing to do. And I'm struggling to understand why Noaa, which is obligated under the law to consult with the BOEM as it grants these permits, would be willing to take this risk. I mean, I guess that's my last question for you, Mr. Oliver.
I would answer, Congressman, that our role in this under the MMPA is to not authorize the surveys themselves, but authorize the marine mammal take that might occur incidental to these surveys with the necessary mitigation, reporting, and monitoring requirements that we believe would be a negligible impact, but that's different than actually.
You keep on referencing the word negligible. I think it's important. We can get lost in the technical language. These air gun blasts happen every 10 seconds for hours on end, for weeks on end, to a species that calls the ocean home. They're literally bombs going off for those animals every 10 seconds of every hour of every day for prolonged periods of time. I don't think that's a negligible impact, and I think the science makes clear that's not the case. With that, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Oliver, I represent a region in the state of Idaho, also a landlocked state, and will just tell you right up front, my level of expertise on the right whale is quite negligible. So I had to do just a little bit of homework on this, and I want to just share with you what I found. I think for the most part, it tends to line up with what you were saying, but it appears to me that the primary habitat for this species is 3 locations. There's the Atlantic, North Pacific, and the Bering Sea. And at least according to the information that I'm finding, the population fluctuation, up or down, doesn't seem to be different in any of those regions. But yet, and by the way, the ocean traffic has been constant on both, with the highest ocean traffic actually in the Atlantic. And so I've been intrigued by the seismic conversation, and most of that activity takes place in the Gulf of Mexico, which this is not potentially part of that habitat, but also some in the Atlantic. Yet there doesn't appear to be any difference in the population trend. You did talk about this, but I just need to hear you re-edify that. What's the biggest impact? I mean, what's the biggest impact negatively on the population of these animals?
Congressman, certainly in the case of the North Atlantic right whale, and there may be some slight differences in the population trajectories of the different species. As we noted earlier, other whales on the East Coast are increasing at a rate of 3 to 5% in many cases. By far, the primary sources of mortality are vessel collision or gear entanglement, followed by vessel strikes. Those are the 2 sources of right whale mortality, of direct mortality and serious injury.
And just for the record, that's what the data that I see is in agreement. It's in agreement with that. And so do you have anything specific in your data that indicates that seismic activity is, I just don't see it where I'm looking, and I'm wondering if you have any data on that.
Well, there is certainly information, Congressman, that seismic activity, acoustic activity, air guns, however you want to characterize it, does have sublethal effects on various activities of marine mammals, including the North Atlantic right whale, can affect their behavior, their movements, their migrations, can affect their feeding behavior, it can affect their breeding behavior, and collectively, those sublethal effects are precisely why we prescribe what we believe are fairly significant mitigation requirements upon that seismic activity.
Mr. Oliver, then if that's the case, then why wouldn't there be more of a fluctuation in the population, or decline in this case, in areas where most of that is happening today?
I can't answer that question specifically. Again, we don't believe that seismic activity is a source of any significant source at all of direct mortality or serious injury. So it's hard to tease apart what could be longer-term effects on a different species of whale. But again, if your question was, does this seismic activity result in mortalities of whales? The answer, we believe, is it doesn't. It will not.
Okay. Mr. Oliver, thank you for being in for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Huffman, and thank you, Mr. Oliver, for joining us today. I think we all agree how important it is to listen to scientists when developing public policy, particularly in an area like this, where certain industries may have an outsized influence. Mr. Oliver, your agency has been inconsistent in its approach to the rules on sounds in our ocean. First, in the Gulf, your rules say that some sounds below 160 decibels can negatively impact whales, yet in the Atlantic, you allow all sounds up to 160 decibels, some of which wouldn't be allowed in the Gulf. 160 decibels, as you may know, can rupture human eardrums. So my question for you, Mr. Oliver, is did any career scientists or other career staff object to the differences in these policies? Did they write any memos or emails to voice their concern, or did they express their concerns orally?
Well, Congressman Levin, if I understand your question correctly, it relates to the different application of measures in the Gulf and the Atlantic. While there is some desire for consistency across regions, there are very significant differences in both the bathymetric aspects of those two oceans and very different species involved in those different whale species. And I can't cite the specific species and the decibel ranges that they are sensitive to, but different species that exist in those two different oceans are very sensitive to different bands of decibel and megahertz. And so what works for some species doesn't work for others.
So with respect, I don't think you answered my question. Again, did any career scientists or other career staff object to the differences in these policies?
I'm not certain I understand what policies you're referring to, but the answer is no.
So I find that hard to believe, seeing it as it is such a significant change in policy to allow sounds up to 160 decibels in the Atlantic, but not in the Gulf. That's the correct policy, right?
My understanding is those differences are based on the scientific expertise of career staff who recognize the appropriateness of those different applications.
And can the committee see any evidence of that disagreement with scientific backup? Can that be provided to the committee?
We'll certainly provide you all the scientific information we used in making those determinations. Yes, sir.
That'd be helpful. And Mr. Oliver, this wasn't the only controversial decision the agency made. You also decided not to look at the cumulative impacts of the authorizations you issued. Similar question, did any career scientists or other career staff object to the failure to evaluate cumulative impacts
of multiple incidental harassment authorizations, or IHAs?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
I also find that very hard to believe given the significance of the policy. Were there any other aspects of the decision to issue the incidental harassment authorizations that caused dissent within the agency? And if there were, what was the nature of that dissent?
No, sir, not to my opinion, not to my knowledge.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned about how the decision to endanger the right whale was made. I believe the committee should insist on the production of any documents held by the agency that express concerns about the impact of the decision on the right whales. We won't be able to know the true basis for the decision unless we get these documents, and I find it incredibly hard to believe that there wasn't significant internal debate. So I look forward to the production of those documents to the committee, Mr. Oliver, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair, and I believe I heard you, Mr. Oliver, agree to share those documents with the committee. Did I hear you correctly?
Sure, yes, sir.
Good. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Oliver, I want to thank you for being here and recognize your expertise in so many different groups and organizations that supported you being appointed to this position, and the high level of professionalism you bring to it. As we're discussing the right whale, I am from Georgia, and of course this is the official marine mammal of Georgia, and the right whale has calving grounds in the waters off the coast of our state, and of course these are beautiful mammals and draw a great deal of tourism. People go into Jekyll Island, Tybee Island, and the likes, go out looking for dolphins and whatever, but all the while keeping their fingers crossed that perhaps they'll have an opportunity to see a right whale along the way. Why is it that the right whale is only off the coast of Georgia for certain months, as I understand it, between November and April?
I have to admit, sir, among my expertises is I'm not a cetacean expert, and I don't, and that is their typical migration pattern. As far as I know, it's been their pattern for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I don't know exactly why they're there at that time of year, but they seem to be there pretty much every year. I'd be happy to...
Right, because well, you said it, it's a migratory pattern. That's what they do. They come there and they leave. And it's something they've been doing for hundreds or thousands or ever how long, a number of years. It's the pattern, is what they do. And so when there is a migratory animal such as this, that means that they are there certain times of the year and they're not there certain times of the year as a general rule. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. So would this have part of the explanation why Noaa Fisheries issued an incidental harassment authorization to the company Deepwater Wind to survey off the coast of Rhode Island in order to build Block Island Wind Farm?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the reason, just to be sure, is because it would be an incidental harassment, which means what? Can you explain what an incidental harassment authorization is?
What it essentially means is you can intentionally harass, but you can incidentally to the activity being proposed, incidentally interact, harass, in this case, the acoustic signals from the air guns. If we find, again, that it has an overall negligible impact on the species and we impose appropriate mitigation, monitoring, and enforcement standards to minimize that interaction.
Right, so you're minimizing the potential problems because in this case you have a migratory mammal that's, and so you try to exercise those sounds more than likely when they're not present, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. So let me kind of land where I'm going here. As I understand it, there's no real unique difference between the needs of renewable sources and oil and gas development when you're coming to surveying the shore or the ocean bottom. Is that correct?
Again, I'm not an expert on hydroacoustics. There may be some differences in the sound, the acoustic signal between seismic for oil and gas versus seismic for siting a wind facility, but I think that essentially they're very similar.
Yeah, if you're trying to determine the ocean floor, it doesn't matter what you're surveying the ocean floor, the purpose for it, whether it's renewable energy or oil and gas. If you're surveying the floor, it's basically the same technology for either. That's my understanding. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, my understanding is they're very similar. Some may be shooting for a deeper signal in the case of oil and gas, for example, than siting a wind turbine, which may not have to go down as deep to know what you want to know. But
so we should be able to pursue all of the above safely.
I believe we can, and I don't believe our agency has ever denied an application for that type of activity.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heist. The chair asks unanimous consent to allow the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, to sit at the dais during some of the testimony. Without objection, it is so ordered, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Sablon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to Mr. Oliver and the other witnesses for joining us and sharing your. I have one question, Mr. Oliver. Noaa currently protects, again, critical habitat for right whales, which includes, again, the feeding areas and calving grounds. However, the whales' twice-yearly migratory route through the Mid-Atlantic, which connect these two habitats are not protected. Does Noaa Fisheries have plans to ensure right whale migratory routes are officially recognized as critical habitat and establish the necessary protections for their migratory routes in the Mid-Atlantic?
Congressman, my understanding is that they're typically the southern region where they calve, which hasn't changed much. Some of their activity on the other end, up north, has moved northward and seaward, and so there are some changes occurring in their movement patterns is what we're critical for us to understand. But my understanding is the migration pattern that you're referring to at the time it occurs and at the time they're in those waters is why we have the mitigation measure that we put in place to, and there are critical habitat areas within that, including the calving grounds, that are always closed. But it's my understanding that the mitigation measures were intended to address that very issue of where the wells are and when.
I have other, let me just ask Mr. Oliver a yes or no answer. Are you also the responsible, do you have oversight authority over Westpac? This is not a right whale question, but do you have authority over Western Pacific Fisheries Council?
I don't know what you mean by authority over.
I mean, do you, they have supervisory,
We do not have direct supervisory authority over the councils. They're not employees.
Okay. All right, okay, just a question, thank you. At this time, I yield the remainder of my time to the chairman of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Sablon. I won't take the full amount of time, but Mr. Oliver, I do want to ask you this. You mentioned that you're in the middle of a reconsultation on the existing biological opinion for the Northern Atlantic right whale, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you only do a reconsultation if the existing biological opinion protections are not working. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, there are a number of...
If everything's just fine and the species is on the path to recovery, you don't have to do a reconsultation.
This is also the subject, sir, apologies, of ongoing litigation, so I'm a little bit limited in how I can respond.
All right, but fair to say that there's strong reason to believe that existing protections that are in place under the biological opinion are not putting this species on a path to recovery. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I would agree that there were perhaps deficiencies in the biological opinion itself, which may be a little bit separate issue than the measures that we currently have in place. I think that based on the results of this biological opinion, it may well indicate that we need to take additional measures.
Very good. And the downward trajectory of the population would also suggest that this is a time for more protection, not less. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir. Protection from the primary sources of mortality, certainly.
The mission of the National Marine Fisheries Service is not to promote fossil fuel energy dominance, is it?
That's correct.
The prior administration, under the same facts, under the same science, at a time when the population was actually doing better than it is today, found that the risk of extinction from these 5 companies doing seismic testing to make money on oil and gas development was vastly greater, outweighed the monetary interests of these companies. They said no to the oil and gas industry. I'm going to ask you a question that I realize is without any precedent in this administration. But what if you had said no in this administration to the oil and gas industry as the previous administration was prepared to do under the same facts and the same science? How long would you have kept your job?
Well, I don't know, Mr. Chairman. I never contemplated that. I contemplated
think you'd be sitting here today? You think you'd be sitting here today if you had said no to the oil and gas industry?
I do not know, sir.
All right, fair enough. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cunningham from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Joe Cunningham, represent South Carolina's 1st District, which is a coastal area from Charleston all the way down to Hilton Head. It's fair to say that seismic air gun blasting is extremely disruptive and loud, correct?
I didn't hear the last.
It's fair to say that seismic air gun blasting is extremely loud and disruptive. Is that correct?
I don't know exactly how loud it is. I have never actually directly experienced it myself. And when you say disruptive, I can't answer that question unless you elaborate on what you mean by disruptive to what.
Okay, well, let's say, do you think the sound of a washing machine is loud or disruptive?
Not particularly.
Okay. What about, say, like an air horn?
You're getting there.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'd ask for unanimous consent to sound an air horn in committee.
Is there objection to the gentleman's demonstration? Without objection, the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I would assume that it will annoy us, but it won't kill us.
Hearing no objection, the gentleman may demonstrate.
Thank you. I'd like to give anyone an opportunity to leave if they would find it bothersome.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I suspect that opportunity also exists for every whale and other little critter in the ocean.
I don't think they receive advance notice of the seismic testing in cetacean language,
that's not
but
correct. You told us that they get to 10 seconds interval between every blast. I think there'd be plenty of time to go to the next
gentleman may proceed.
Thank you.
Section of the ocean.
Was that disruptive, Mr. Oliver?
So it was irritating, but I didn't find it particularly disruptive.
Okay. What about every, say, 10 seconds? Like seismic air gun blasting goes on for days, weeks, months?
If I were that close to it, yeah, probably.
Yeah. What if you depended on sound for hunting your food and for communication? Do you think it would be disruptive?
At a distance of 20 feet, yes, it would be.
How much louder do you think seismic air gun blasting sounds than this air horn you just heard?
I honestly don't know.
Take a guess. 10 times?
At a distance of how far?
Well, say you're within a reasonable distance. Say you're within a quarter of a mile. Is it 10 times? 25 times?
Honestly, don't know.
I mean, can you take a guess?
No.
100 times? You think it's 1,000 times louder?
I doubt it.
Doubt it. What if I were to tell you it's 16,000 times louder than what you just heard here? Can you see how that would be impactful on marine species and mammals?
I do, which is why we put mitigation measures in to minimize the proximity of that activity with the whales in question.
You think you can cure all of the effects that come from seismic air gun blasting to these species that it's impacting?
I don't know what effects are that we're curing, sorry.
Yeah. Well, such as the killing of our species.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, if that was a question, I'll repeat what I said earlier. There's absolutely no evidence that these sounds and activities have ever killed or seriously injured a marine mammal or a right whale.
You would, and you've heard earlier testimony how various states along the eastern seaboard, including South Carolina, are adamantly opposed to offshore drilling, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How do you feel about imposing seismic air gun blasting, which is impactful to marine species, in search for oil and gas in which the residents and citizens of South Carolina do not even want?
Congressman, our role under the MMPA is to either authorize the activity or not, based on a number of findings that do not include a popular vote.
Do you think South Carolina has a right to determine what happens off its shorelines?
I certainly within certain distances that perhaps envelop state waters.
Mm-hmm. But outside state waters, you don't think they have any decision whatsoever as to what happens off their shorelines and what could ultimately wash upon our beaches?
I don't write the laws that dictate where states' rights, where states' authorities versus federal authorities lie.
And I'm not asking for your legal interpretation. I'm just asking your personal opinion about this.
I don't have an opinion on that.
You don't have an opinion?
No, sir.
Okay. Would you like to know or have an opinion about what happens within your neighborhood or your state?
I think we're going to end with that rhetorical question. The gentleman's time has expired.
I appreciate your time, Mr. Oliver. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Beyer, the great state of Virginia, also on the migratory route of the North Atlantic right whale, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for including me and for allowing me some time. This is a very important issue to me. All of our Virginia coastal communities are united against the oil and gas and against the seismic testing. And I'm going to be reintroducing the Atlantic Seismic Airgun Protection Act today to establish a moratorium on geological and geophysical activity related to oil and gas exploration and development in the Atlantic Ocean. If I could, will my friend from South Carolina yield for a question?
Without objection.
No objection.
Could you tell me what the decibel level on the air horn was?
On the air horn, it's 120 decibels.
Great. Thank you very much. So Mr. Oliver, you know, and by the way, on this sound traveling, we know that subsonic travel, the sound travels, 2,500 miles in the ocean, which is Washington, D.C., all the way to San Francisco. So you can't escape in 10 seconds that 2,500 miles. My understanding is that your agency took the position that the North Atlantic right whales are not harassed by sounds unless they're exposed to a sound at the level of 160 decibels or higher. And obviously, every 10 decibel, I believe, is a doubling in the sound volume. But in the Gulf of Mexico, your same agency did only 120 decibels, which is, many, many times. Why the difference?
And again, a similar question came up earlier. I think while there's some desire to maintain a consistency in how we issue authorizations in different bodies of water, there are very different ocean conditions, bathymetry, and most importantly, very different species we're talking about. And the different whale species have different vulnerabilities or different typical acoustical patterns that they operate within, so different decibels affect different whale species differently.
Well, we can establish that 160 decibels is incredibly loud. In fact, that's twice as loud as what's necessary to rupture the human eardrum. The Republican objection that seems to hang on two things that happened in the Obama administration. NMFS, you guys, 2014 said, quote, "To date, there's no evidence of serious injury, death, or stranding by marine mammals can occur from exposure to airgun pulses." And then Boehm in 2014 said, "To date, there's been no documented scientific evidence adversely affect marine animal populations." Since you're not on the next panel, let me just quote from some of the abundance of contrary evidence. For example, right whales, as well as many marine animals, are highly dependent on a naturally quiet ocean for basic life functions. That protecting right whales protects entire ocean ecosystems. Whales act as incidental farmers of the seafood, capturing food at depth and releasing nutrients at the surface. Right whales, the acoustics will increase the likelihood of mother-calf separations, the likelihood of acoustic communication between whales, on and on and on. None of these are individual right whales being killed, but they're all whole population impacts that affect calving, migrations, lifespan. This is not about acute physical harm to an individual, rather the cost to a marginally surviving population as a result of aggregate chronic noise. And finally, the idea that whales are more like us than most people. Culture, dialects, individual voices, family trees, long-term social structures, that we owe them more than treating them as collateral damage. How do you reconcile this abundance of science, and you've probably seen the many, many, many references, with the NMFS and Boehm decisions in 2014?
I'm not sure I understand what specific 2014 decisions you're referring to, Congressman. But we have, as I mentioned earlier, I don't believe our agency has ever, across any administration, not approved an incidental harassment authorization. Now, depending on the activity and depending on the species, there are different mitigation conditions attached to those authorizations. Let
me ask you different. Can you appreciate that there is a significant difference between a right whale not washing up on the beach being killed by a seismic blast and the population impacts of chronic noise abuse over time?
Yes, I can, Congressman. We have some of the finest marine mammal scientists, experts in the world that work on these authorizations, both in the Gulf of Mexico and on the Atlantic coast. And they know well more than I what the different whale species tolerate and what the appropriate mitigation is for those. And those are the same people that worked on these authorizations.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Just a note for the record, my pregnant committee consultant to my left noted that after Mr. Cunningham did his seismic airgun demonstration, her baby began kicking. So perhaps a data point for you to consider, Mr. Oliver, as we go forward. The chair now recognizes Mr. Keating for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for allowing me a few minutes to speak. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for prioritizing this issue so early in this session, and for your own experience, which I know full well, even with Massachusetts, the studies you've done in this regard. And I do want to talk about that. And I do want to mention that in terms of Mr. Oliver's comments about minimization, we're here and we're concerned with is the minimization of the population of the right whale, the North Atlantic right whale, which is down to approximately 422 whales right now. This is an existential issue in regarding their species, and it's that critical. So where's the trade-off? The trade-off is, number one, trying to do something positive, as my colleague Representative Moulton has, which I'm join him as original co-sponsor of his bill, Save the Right Whale Act of 2019, where we're marshaling resources to try and protect the species. And the trade-off on the other side is oil and gas exploration in our oceans. And a product that we're exporting now around the world, that we have plenty domestically to deal with. And the trade-off isn't even close. And we're just dealing it through the lens of the right whale. I mean, there's a canary in the coal mine effect possible with the right whale and their diminishing species, and the effects on the rest of the ocean. And representing one of the largest coastal areas in the United States, and an area that's dealt extensively with this issue, I wish I had in front of me a picture. It's a picture that I've seen at the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Mass. And it shows a very brave person getting in a very small vessel up against a whale, trying to disentangle that whale, risking their lives to do that. It's an extraordinary picture. That's what we should be about. That's what our values in terms of our environment and protecting our environment are about. And if we're talking about trade-offs and economic factors, I think I can speak all the way from my colleagues to Virginia, to the West Coast, to here. In my district, if you want to just put this on economic terms, it's not even close either. Endangering our coastline and its resources would have devastating impacts economically on my area in particular. This isn't even close. We shouldn't even be discussing this, but we should be marshaling our resources as Saving the Right Whales Act of 2019 in terms of protecting them. We should be here in Congress giving that same heroic effort to preserve the North Atlantic right whale that those people are doing on those very small vessels where they can be overturned in a moment. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I'll advance this anymore by posing questions. I think the answers are altogether too obvious, and I commend you for having the hearing so that we'll have the opportunity to let Congress and let the American public realize that we're making these kind of trade-offs that aren't even close. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Webster of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it for the opportunity. Along that lines, the population of great white whale, there is also an increase in the population of sharks. So, Administrator Oliver, there is a movement that's been tracked, and that's headed from the Massachusetts area down to Florida. And there are a lot of predators that are moving in and prey on white whale calves, which are in that area. And I'm just wondering if these sharks who are preying on these calves is any concern, and is there anything being done about that, or is there anything we could do about that?
Congressman, thank you for the question. That's a good question, one that I don't know the answer to. It's an intriguing question because I know up in the North Pacific with the endangered stellar sea lion, we've had a lot of issues and questions with regard to the effects on that population of killer whale predation. And so I don't know offhand of any documented evidence of right whale calves being taken by sharks, but I was at a South Atlantic Council meeting earlier this week and heard from a number of fishermen they're seeing way more and way bigger sharks than ever, to the fact that they're taking fish off their lines on a routine basis. So given that that there are more and bigger sharks apparently out there, I think you raise a good question, and I would probably want to get back to my expert people and find out whether we have any documentation of shark predation.
Well, there are several proposals out there about sharks, fishing, and even the finning of sharks. And one of the proposals is to just eliminate any shark fishing. But wouldn't that just, if this is true, and there's a lot of documentation from Noaa about the migration of these predators down into the Florida area, even around to the Gulf. To me, I had proposed an idea of trying to draw in the international fishing industry into taking our more conservation style treatment of sharks and yet still not totally prohibiting the fishing of sharks. And I'm just wondering if there is a correlation between that and the number, and is it going to change? And if these predators are coming to Florida, there's going to be a and if their prey is a infant calf, then we're doing great harm to the white whale population, I believe. Would you see a correlation between those two?
Again, Mr. Congressman, I don't know that there's any correlation between the two. I would say that in cases where particular shark species warrant protection, we'll do our best to do that, but we also support sustainable harvest of shark species where there's a sustainable harvest level to be had.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
The gentleman yield his final 40 seconds for a follow-up.
I will.
Mr. Oliver, you said that seismic air blasting can have sublethal effects on right whales, right?
Yes.
And that can include disrupting the communication patterns that allow a mother and a calf to be together. That's one of the ways in which whales communicate, through ocean sound. If one is concerned about shark predation that's limited to baby right whales, there's no shark in the ocean big enough to go toe-to-toe with a mother right whale, correct?
I believe that would be true.
So if we're concerned about shark predation on right whales, we should be concerned about seismic air blasting that causes mothers and calves to be separated in the ocean. And with that, I yield back, and the chair recognizes. There's no extra time. The chair recognizes Mr. Moulton.
Are we operating under a 6-minute rule now, Mr.
I was using the gentleman's. The gentleman is out of order. I was using the time yielded to me specifically.
And you stopped the clock when you borrowed time from another member, and that's getting a little tiresome.
The gentleman is incorrect and out of order. The chair recognizes Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, by even the most generous estimates, there are fewer than 422 right whales left in the ocean. Humans have killed nearly every right whale in existence through our direct and indirect actions over the past 2 centuries. And today, we are at a crossroads. We have a choice. We can be the generation that saves the right whale, or the generation that allows their extinction. The right whale's fate is literally in our hands, in the hands of the members of this committee and this Congress. And I want to thank the committee for having this hearing today and showing their commitment to the right whale, which in turn is a commitment to my region's economy and identity. Let's not miss this unique moment. Last night, with Mr. Huffman, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Keating, and Mr. Posey, I reintroduced the Save Right Whales Act. Mr. Chairman, few people in the history of the earth have had the ability to help a species survive like this. From the passenger pigeon to the western black rhinoceros, humans have driven the extinction of iconic species through centuries of choices. It was a choice to hunt the right whale to near extinction. It was a choice to jeopardize the right whale by drilling off our coasts. So let's be the generation of leaders that chooses to bring the right whale back from the brink. Massachusetts is leading the way. Our bill has the support of scientists like Dr. Scott Krause from the New England Aquarium, a group leading the charge. He will speak with you shortly. It has the support of lobstermen and other members of the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, who know that the fate of our economy in Massachusetts is directly linked to the health of our oceans and the species that live in them. And the Save Right Whales Act has the support of the folks who speak for the whales and so many other iconic species, groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Defenders of Wildlife. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, for your support of this bill in the past, and for prioritizing this hearing in the new Congress. Let's pass the Save Right Whales Act and arm us with the funding we need to be the generation of humans that saves the right whale. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and with that, we will thank and excuse Mr. Oliver. Thanks very much for your testimony, and we will bring forward our second panel. While the panel is coming forward, I'll go ahead and begin the introductions. Our first witness will be Dr. Scott Krause, the Chief Scientist of Marine Mammal Conservation at the New England Aquarium. Next will be Dr. Sterling Burnett, a Senior Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News at the Heartland Institute. And last, we will have Dr. Chris Clark, who is a visiting Senior Scientist at the Bioacoustics Research Program at Cornell Lab. Let me just remind the witnesses under the second panel that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. Their entire statement will, of course, appear in the hearing record. And again, gentlemen, when you begin, you will see the lights that are displayed. As you get closer to the end of your testimony, you'll see a yellow light, and when your time is about to run out, you'll see a red light, and I will encourage you to wrap up at that point. We will allow the entire panel to testify before questions begin. So the chair now recognizes Dr. Scott Krause for 5 minutes. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock, for inviting me to testify on the status of the North Atlantic right whale. I've spent almost 40 years studying this species, publishing over 80 scientific papers on its biology, ecology, and conservation. In addition, my research team curates the North Atlantic right whale catalog, a photographic record of every individual right whale in the population. I'm here to speak to the threats to this species and the need for enhanced federal and state efforts to prevent North Atlantic right whales from going extinct. This species is among the most endangered whale on the planet, with only about 400 left. Despite almost 50 years of federal management efforts, the stock is now declining rapidly. Why does this matter? Whales are incidental farmers of the sea. They fertilize the entire marine food chain, supporting ocean ecosystems and commercial fisheries. Whales are also the basis of a large tourist economy on both coasts, worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. North Atlantic right whales feed in waters off New England and Canada during the spring, summer, and fall, and pregnant females migrate to calving grounds off the southeast U.S. coast to give birth during the winter. This distribution and their migration patterns expose them constantly to threats from human activities, including entanglements in fishing gear, collisions with ships, and disturbance from underwater noise. Right whale deaths from ship strikes and fishery entanglements slow or halt population growth. Our research indicates that twice as many whales die annually than are documented or estimated. In 2017 and 18, 20 right whales were found dead, representing nearly 5% of the population. Of the 12 whales that were examined carefully, all had died from human causes. On the other side of the equation, for right whales to grow in population size, they need to have babies. That means we must reduce the exposure of all whales, but particularly females, to stressors that can slow or stop reproduction. This includes underwater noise, pollutants, and sublethal fishery entanglements. Climate change also likely affects whale health and reproduction. Chronic underwater noise is a proven stressor to right whales. Chronic stressors are known to cause increased disease and mortality and lower reproduction rates in a variety of mammals, including humans. Right whales are already exposed to relentless shipping, dredging, pile driving, and other industrial noises, which are likely impairing their ability to communicate, to find food, and to find mates. In November of 2018, NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service issued 5 incidental harassment authorizations allowing companies to take marine mammals during geophysical surveys off the southeastern United States, which is the only known right whale calving ground. This activity will create a chronic disturbance and raise background noise levels throughout the right whale's habitat, increasing the risk of mother-calf separations. NMF's assertion that the effects of seismic surveys will be transient is not biologically defensible. Airgun noise is constant, with explosions every 10 to 16 seconds. Combined, these authorizations represent about 850 ship days of 24-hour explosions within a single year. Finally, NMF's plan to close seasonally some areas to seismic surveys out to 90 kilometers from shore ignores the recent changes in right whale distribution and the fact that airgun noise travels many hundreds of kilometers underwater. The recent population decline is partly due to deaths from entanglements in fishing gear and collisions with ships. It has been made worse by low calf numbers. None were born in 2018, and only 7 have been born this year. Right whale survival is entirely dependent upon reducing human-caused mortality and eliminating stressors that impact reproduction. Without dedicated efforts to reduce the effects of human activities, this species is likely to go functionally extinct in about 20 years. Despite all this, the North Atlantic right whale is not doomed to extinction. They will adapt to changing conditions, find food in new places, and start having calves again. In the meantime, we need to stop killing them and disrupting their lives. In my expert opinion, NOAA's authorization of the seismic exploration near the right whale calving ground is a step backwards. In contrast, NOAA's existing ship speed limit rule has definitely reduced ship kills, and I am also pleased that NOAA is enhancing efforts to reduce entanglements of right whales in fishing gear. Minimizing the human causes of right whale deaths and reducing stresses that impact right whale health and reproduction will help this species move toward population recovery.
Thank you, Dr. Krause. Next is Dr. Burnett.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and the other distinguished members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm here, I want to say at the outset, we all recognize that energy is a fundamental building block of modern society. And fossil fuels, it's just a fact, now and for the foreseeable future, will supply the lion's share of that energy. The question is, where will we get that energy from going forward, and at what cost? My background, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert in right whales. I'm a philosopher, deal philosophy of science, environmental ethics. My training is to follow the argument where it goes. But my training in applied philosophy says that your values, your choices you make should be informed by facts, by data. Good science, good laws, good public policy all depend on good data. And good data is precisely what we lack concerning the existence, how much oil and gas exists off the Atlantic coast, where it's located, in what volumes and what formations. It's been 40 years. And while it is certainly true that many governors and on the East Coast object to oil and gas drilling, they're making decisions for them and future governors in ignorance. They're making these decisions with their eyes blinded because we don't have the data. They can't make an informed decision because we don't know how much is there, so how much they would be foregoing. Now, it may be the case that good data will show the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf contains little or so widely dispersed, not captured in large appreciable volumes, that it would support their decisions and it would make it easier because oil companies just won't want to go out there. And at current prices, they probably don't want to go out there. Alternatively, an updated, accurate assessment with the newest technology could show vast volumes and may change their or future governors' minds, especially when the next recession comes, and we know recessions will come, and their budgets are strained, and they're figuring out a way to pay for their education, pay for their roads, pay for other things. But regardless, they should make these decisions not on outdated data, not on poor science, but on the best available science, and that requires new testing, comprehensive testing. Now, threats to whales consist of, nature in part. They start from a low population size, even a lower fertile breeding population of females. They're slow to reproduce, and then they face all the human threats. The dominant ones, and I won't go into it, but we all know from testimony earlier today, the dominant ones are vessel strikes and entanglement. I don't know it's the case, but I wonder if pollution, plastics pollution in the ocean might also be contributing to that. If so, tourism then is contributing to whale struggles. But I keep hearing the concern. I keep hearing the concern about offshore seismic testing, but I don't hear the same concern concerning offshore seismic testing for wind turbines. hundreds of which will have to be located precisely in the, not a few dispersed over large areas of the ocean, but hundreds of which in concentrated areas of the ocean right along the migration routes. But the same seismic testing. So I don't know if the Save the Right Whales, I haven't had a chance to review it, Act deals with just seismic testing for oil and gas, or if it deals with all seismic testing. But if it doesn't deal with all seismic testing, then it's dishonest. It's just against oil and gas. It's not about the right whales. It's about oil and gas. Because protecting the right whales would demand the same thing for wind farms. I note that just a month ago, you had a woman from the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association testify, and she spent 3 paragraphs in her testimony talking about the threats from wind farms to the fishing industry and a paragraph concerning right whales. She spent 1 paragraph concerning oil spills for the oil industry. So she certainly sees it as a bigger threat, but no one seems to be addressing that or care. I'll stop there.
I thank the gentleman. Dr. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock for inviting me to testify on behalf of North Atlantic right whales and the potential impacts of noise from seismic airgun surveys on this highly endangered population. Like Scott, Dr. Krause, I've been studying right whales since a long time, since 1973. And scientific studies over these last 4 to 5 decades have confirmed that baleen whales, including North Atlantic right whales, produce an extraordinary variety of sounds which they use for all types of critical life functions, such as communicating, navigating, mating, and maintaining social bonds, such as those between mothers and calves. There is also compelling evidence that baleen whales, including North Atlantic right whales, have excellent low-frequency hearing. The low-frequency, extremely loud explosions produced by seismic air guns fall right on top of that frequency range in which right whales produce these sounds. Right whales are highly dependent on contact calls, a means of maintaining social contact and coming together in social groups. Mothers and calves use very soft calls to maintain close proximity in order for the calf to nurse and increase the chances of a mother protecting her calf from killer whales and sharks. These interactions are dependent on listening for and recognizing sounds under naturally quiet conditions. Research has shown that right whales produce contact calls and counter calls in every location along the East Coast where we've listened. Calling whales are detected throughout the year in regions and at times of year when they were not expected to occur. In some cases, as far out as the continental shelf break, that's 90 to 150 kilometers offshore. Why am I so absolutely certain that the noise from seismic airgun arrays will jeopardize and increase the risk of harm to North Atlantic right whales? Noise from seismic airgun explosions have been detected throughout the North Atlantic and are essentially everywhere. We have heard airguns even when the seismic surveys were conducted far, far away from the recorders. I'm talking about recording them on the eastern U.S. coast to seismic explosions off Canada, 1,200 kilometers away, French Guiana, 3,800 kilometers away, and Western Ireland, 5,000 kilometers away. Explosions off Virginia will propagate into the waters off New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and elsewhere. Because these surveys occur in distant places and influence the ocean's acoustic environment over such enormous areas, these are areas of many hundreds of thousands of kilometers squared and temporal scales, years on end, assessing the full scale of this chronic impact is challenging. But I am convinced that the most critical impacts are chronic, not acute. My deep concern about seismic impacts on right whales comes from responses of bowhead whales, a close relative to seismic surveys. Susanna Blackwell and her colleagues have shown that bowhead whale calling rates increased as soon as airgun pulses were detected, then plateaued as increased receive levels occurred, began decreasing as receive levels continued to rise, and then ceased entirely at higher levels. In other words, the whales initially adapt to the noise and then eventually just give up. In my opinion, this significant and consistent response by an endangered species to seismic airgun arrays is alarming, given that none of the proposed monitoring or mitigation actions proposed for North Atlantic right whales can determine whether or not right whales modify their calling behavior from the proposed seismic activities, and the inability to observe a response is not evidence of no response. Right whales, as well as many marine animals, are dependent upon a naturally quiet ocean for basic life functions. Seismic airgun arrays off the East Coast will significantly change that acoustic ecosystem. We know that the sounds from seismic airgun arrays propagate and change the acoustic environment through enormous areas. We know that a close relative of right whales, the bowhead whale, starts to react to seismic noise at extraordinarily low levels and continues reacting until whales stop communicating altogether. The level of seismic airgun activity authorized by NIMS is irresponsible and likely to cause significant impacts on right whale acoustic behavior. For right whales, such changes could likely increase mother-calf separations, decrease acoustic communication between whales, and influence acoustic behaviors that are essential for maintaining the population's social cohesion and integrity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. We'll now move to questions for the second panel, and I will begin recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Clark, you are the expert on bioacoustics and the impacts of these things on North Atlantic right whales. Can you please address this claim we've heard that acoustic sounds produced by seismic testing do not threaten the North Atlantic right whale? We've heard, for example, that it's merely a sublethal impact, the implication being that that's no big deal. I'd like you to speak to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the disparity between saying that I do something that actually kills an individual, that's an acute impact, or I deafen them to the point that they're basically dysfunctional, versus a chronic impact. You all know what chronic impacts are like.
A chronic impact could still cause the extinction of a struggling species. Is that fair to say?
A chronic impact will increase the stresses, like Dr. Krause has talked about. Chronic impacts, we get chronic impacts from smoke, secondhand smoke, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the constant, deliberate debilitation of the species.
Thank you. We've also heard that a more protective standard in the Gulf Coast is justified because the bathymetry and I guess the greater tolerance for acoustic noise in the Atlantic justifies a more relaxed standard. You heard that testimony. Do you agree with it?
I think it's nonsense.
Dr. Krause, you've authored more than 80 scientific publications on the right whale. Do you think the seismic testing poses an existential threat to this species, and why?
I do, and it's not because it causes mortality. The only time seismic activity would actually kill a whale would be one if the whale was really dumb or deaf. Generally, the activity is exactly as Dr. Clark pointed out. It's a chronic, long-distance, widespread impact, and there have been no actual studies that indicate that would actually answer the question about the long-term sort of seismic impacts on populations, because you can't do those studies easily. The short-term studies that have looked at the response of seismic activity by many different species of whales shows that nearly all of them respond. They hear it, but they just can't do anything about it. And so in the case of right whales, where you have an already stressed population with significant multiple impacts that are occurring at multiple levels, the addition of additional stressors is just a bad idea.
All right, Dr. Krause, you know these whales individually better than anyone. Can you please tell us about the condition of the roughly 100 breeding females?
So female condition is measured by a series of both photographic and physiological measurements, and it turns out that of the animals that we have still alive, most of them are in a steady state. They've been in a relatively slow decline over the last 30 years. They have stabilized, but we know exactly sort of what the threshold of reproduction is, and many of them are just above it, so that additional stressors can change their physiology, change stress responses in a way that would actually reduce their fitness and their ability to produce calves.
And Dr. Krause, finally, why are the mitigation measures proposed by NIMFS and its incidental harassment authorizations insufficient to ensure the survival of this species?
Yeah, the mitigation strategies employed by for all of these seismic activities are a little bit of a lipstick on a pig. That is to say, they will prevent immediate mortality if a whale gets so close that it's going to get blown up. They will have nothing to do with mitigating the long-term impacts and the chronic elevation of ambient noise levels for hundreds of kilometers around the seismic vessel.
All right, thanks very much for your testimony, all of the witnesses, and I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The central issue in this hearing seems to be the effect of seismic testing on the North Atlantic right whale. The contention is that it is driving them to extinction. Now, Dr. Burnett, coincidence obviously does not prove causation, but causation must show coincidence, correct?
Yes, it should be correlation, yes.
Yet we don't see coincidence with the population of other whale species in the North Atlantic. As we have heard, other whale species continue to grow in population in the same region, several of the species having reached their pre-whaling levels. So if seismic activity was fatal to whales, would we not be seeing the same effect on other species populations?
I can't think of a reason why not, and you would find it in other right whale species in the southern hemisphere where they are currently undertaking seismic testing.
Now, we had a dramatic demonstration with the air horn, and it was annoying. The implication of this and the discussion that followed was that any fish or mammal species in the ocean is going to stay in the immediate proximity of this annoying phenomenon. Is that a reasonable assumption to make?
Well, many will. Of course, when they tested in North Carolina, a test that the National Science Foundation also found did not pose negligible danger to sea species, some species abandoned the area for the time of the testing and then came back into the area after the testing.
I think our common sense tells us that any fish or mammal population is going to move away from such an annoying sound. I think that the reaction of every person in this room, had it continued, would be to leave the room. We learned today that seismic testing has been going on in the Atlantic for 80 years. Up until the last decade, we were actually seeing an increase in the population of the North Atlantic right whale, about 2.8% a year. What does that tell us about cause and effect?
Well, it tells us there doesn't seem to be a cause and effect on whale mortality and decline, that there are a number of factors. It turns out the Canadians are just now getting on board with some of the shipping things that we've been doing for a decade, and that will hopefully and should hopefully reduce right whale mortality. I see no evidence, however, that limiting seismic testing, whether, you know, I see no difference between the seismic testing for wind and that would evidently be allowed, but not for oil and gas.
Well, I'm going to get to that in a moment if I can, but while we're on the general subject of populations, it's been said that there are only 411 right whales left in the North Atlantic. Certainly, they number just in the hundreds. It gets worse if you look at the North Pacific right whale population. I'm told they number only in the tens. But in the southern hemisphere, they have a healthy population of 16,000, which is growing at about the pace that we're seeing of other whale species around the world. What does that tell us?
I guess I can't honestly say for sure what it tells us. I don't know what the difference is in shipping lanes, in fishing entanglement, in other factors that may be interfering with the recovery of the white whale here.
I should think so, and I, again, would imagine it may have something to do with the fact that the population in the North Atlantic was hunted almost to extinction, and when you have that small a population, it's very difficult for it to recover. Is that accurate?
I would suppose it's accurate. I would also suppose it might have implications for the genetic diversity within the species and perhaps genetic disorders from close interbreeding populations.
Point taken. We heard about inconsistency and politically motivated decisions, but again, as we know, the Obama administration issued many seismic testing permits, including in the Atlantic for Columbia University, USGS. Why are those permits good and the recent permits are bad?
I can't, that's my problem, is I can't explain the difference. It seems to be that if it has to, seismic testing is bad for oil and gas, but it's good for everything else, and that's curious if what you're really concerned about is the right whale.
So it's a double standard then. It's not the seismic testing, it's the purpose of the seismic testing.
Correct.
And since science is based on data, and the purpose of seismic testing is to collect data, why would any scientist want to blind themselves to that, particularly as we've already established, it has no effect on the populations of other whales?
I can think of no good reason.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Krause, do you believe that multiple stressors and threats compound the impacts on the North Atlantic right whale?
I do. I think that we know that they're getting affected by ships and entanglements, but what we know less about is the sublethal effects of those entanglements and the sublethal effects of noise. We do know that they have physiological responses that indicate a stress response, and that stress response, when accumulated over time, is damaging.
Let me ask you this. Did the National Marine Fisheries Service consider the suite of stressors already present, and did they assess whether the addition of seismic testing would further compound these stressors?
In my reading of the IHAs and the biological opinion, I did not see that.
Well, then what about the cumulative effect of 5 different companies doing seismic surveys?
I didn't see that either. They did not seem to combine the analysis.
Dr. Krause and Dr. Clark, both of you, the North Atlantic right whale population was growing as recently as the early 2000s. And on average, almost 25 calves were born each year. The population has been in decline since 2010, and now approximately less than 420 individuals remain. In the 2017-2018 calving season, no new calves were observed. This year, we've seen 7 births, but after 20 deaths. Since 2017, the population has not seemed to grow overall. In your expert opinion, would the use of seismic airgun blasting for oil exploration in the Atlantic be a threat, a potential threat, to the survival of the species?
Who would you like?
Both of you.
Okay, my opinion is that it does represent a threat, largely because of the very quiet communications between mothers and calves, and the fact that half of the population equation is dependent. If we're going to bring this population back, it's going to be dependent upon right whales having enough calves to start to replenish the animals that are lost from the mortalities. In order to do that, we need to give the mothers and their calves every possible chance.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I believe it's a threat. I've observed what right whales do when noise levels go up. Their communications stop. Their aggregation on food resources is, they go into random walks, especially they do not aggregate appropriately on food resources. And all of that has a serious potential impact on the animal's ability to gain fat and grow, and mothers to come into estrus and have calves.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just like to point out that I do have legislation that would disallow the permitting of the 5 seismic studies. It's H.R. 1149. It is a bipartisan piece of legislation. It's called the Atlantic Coastal Economics Protection Action Act, and I welcome anybody who is interested in joining on as a co-sponsor, and I would like to yield the remaining time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The ranking member just asked a series of questions about right whale biology to a witness with a philosophy degree from a conservative think tank. Seems like we should maybe pose some of these questions to our right whale experts. We've heard that right whales in the southern hemisphere are doing much better. We've heard that other whale species in the northern hemisphere are doing better. I'm not sure what the implication is. Maybe our North Atlantic right whales are just defective and we should stop trying to protect them. Dr. Krause, you're the expert. Would you like to speak to these claims?
The right whales in the southern hemisphere tend to occur south of about 45 degrees south latitude, and they are south of most of the seismic activity in the southern hemisphere. The right whales in the northern hemisphere, by contrast, are actually quite in the middle of a lot of industrial activity, shipping, fishing, and a lot of stuff like that. As other people have pointed out, there hasn't been any seismic activity in the Atlantic for the last 40 years, except for very short periods of time. There's no comparability between the seismic activity in terms of sound source levels or extent or the time period, or rather the duration of that activity between wind farms, between the geophysical surveys that the Langseth did off the coast, and between compared to the kind of magnitude and the number of ship days involved in the proposed activities.
So fair to say this would be a new and fundamentally different stressor at the worst possible time for this species.
And many times more. The magnitude is it's completely different.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses. We have reached the end of this hearing. Now, yes.
I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the committee record the status of whales report of the International Whaling Commission and a April 2018 paper by John Droz regarding offshore fossil fuel exploration and development.
Without objection, those will be entered into the record. One of the courtesies that Democrats routinely granted to a subcommittee chair, Mr. Gosar, was to allow a final 1 minute or less question to each of the witnesses on the panel, to ask them essentially, what is the one thing you weren't asked that you wish you had been asked? I would like to request unanimous consent from my Republican colleagues to grant that same courtesy so that we could ask that final question to our panelists.
Well, Mr. Chairman, courtesy is as courtesy does, and unfortunately, because of your handling of my request for unanimous consent to borrow from credited time to Mr. Webster, I'm really not inclined to do that. This is outside the normal scope of the hearing and outside the House rules.
Well, I'm disappointed that courtesy will not continue under this ranking member. But with that, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and also the members for their question. The members of the committee will have some additional questions for the witnesses, or may have some, and we will ask that the witnesses respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.
To